Hi, and welcome to section 3.5 for Econ 2 on the AQA exam board. Today we'll be looking at inflation, we'll be looking at cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. But first, let's go on to some definitions of inflation, deflation and disinflation. Let's first start with inflation. Inflation is the increase in the price level over a period of time. Usually, this period of time is a year. Deflation is the decrease in the price level over a period of time. Again, usually measured over a year. Disinflation is a decrease in the inflation rate. For example, we would have disinflation if inflation last year was 2% and now inflation is 1%. So inflation is an increase in the price level. Deflation is a decrease in the price level, and disinflation is a decrease in the inflation rate. So how do we measure inflation? There are two ways to work out the inflation rate in the UK. They are the Retail Price Index, known as the RPI, and the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is a weighted average on what consumers spend their money on. Over time, these weights change depending on consumer spending habits. If consumers spend more of their income on food, then the weight given to food in the CPI would increase. The Retail Price Index is an arithmetic mean, meaning that all prices are included when working out the RPI. Inflation erodes the real purchasing power of money. This is because the same amount of money can buy less goods when the price of these goods increase. Economic agents form expectations based on what they believe the inflation rate will be. If firms believe that inflation in the future will be higher, then they will set higher prices now. Furthermore, if consumers believe that the price of goods and services will be higher in the future, they may choose to consume those goods and services now rather than consume them in the future. On the contrary, if there was deflation, which is when the price level is falling, consumers may choose to delay consuming goods and services now and instead consume them in the future when these goods and services are cheaper. Furthermore, if the price level fluctuates a lot, it is harder for economic agents to form these expectations. The government wants inflation to remain constant and fairly stable over a period of time. This is why the UK government gives the Bank of England an inflation target. The UK government has given the Bank of England an inflation target of 2% per annum. The Bank of England is an independent institution from the government, and they control the monetary policy for the UK. If inflation is greater than 1% away from this target, i.e. is less than 1 or greater than 3%, the Bank of England has to write a letter to the government explaining why inflation is away from the target and what they expect inflation to be in the future. There are two main sources of inflation. The first is cost push inflation, and the second is demand pull inflation. Let's first look at cost push inflation. Cost push inflation is whereby there is an increase in the price of a factor of production which firms use, such as an increase in the price of oil. If there was to be a large increase in the price of oil, production would become more expensive for firms. This causes the SRAS curve to shift to the left. It shifts inwards. There is now a new equilibrium in the economy whereby the price level is higher than it was before, i.e. we have inflation, and there is less output being produced in the economy for both the classical and Keynesian view of the economy in the short run. So let's first look at the classical AD-AS diagram. Before the increase in the price of oil, our economy was at an equilibrium at point A, where real output was Y1 and the price level was PL1. An increase in the price of oil makes it more expensive for firms to produce goods and services. This causes the SRAS curve to shift inwards. It shifts to the left from SRAS 1 to SRAS 2. This causes there to be a new short-run equilibrium in the economy, which is at point B, where less real output is produced, Y2 rather than Y1, and the price level in the economy is higher, PL2 rather than PL1. The increase in the price level is the cost push inflation. Here we have a Keynesian ADAS diagram. Before the shock increase in oil price, the economy was at equilibrium at point A, with a price level PL1 and a real output of Y1. When there is the price shock, which is the increase in the price of oil, the LRAS curve shifts upwards, moves upwards, and this causes there to be a new equilibrium in the economy, which is at point B. At equilibrium B, the price level in the economy is higher, which is the cost push inflation, and real output is lower, Y2 rather than Y1. The price level is PL2 rather than PL1. There are many reasons for cost push inflation. One reason is a change in commodity prices. Commodities are traded globally, and changes in world commodity prices will affect domestic inflation. During 2014 and 2015, commodity prices fell dramatically, especially oil. This led to inflation in the UK being close to zero, which is well below the 2% target for the Bank of England. However, in 2008-2009, oil prices were at record levels and inflation in the UK was just above 5%. The inflation rate of above 5% was largely explained by the increase in the price of oil, but other commodity price increases also played a role. Another reason for cost push inflation is a fall in the exchange rate. When an exchange rate falls, it makes imports more expensive. If the economy relies on imported resources to produce goods and services, the fall in the exchange rate will make these resources more expensive. This increases the cost of production for firms, and the cost increase are passed on to consumers through higher prices. Cost push inflation can also arise due to an increase in a factor of production costs, such as an increase in labour costs. Similarly to a fall in the exchange rate, if wages were to increase, this would make production more expensive for firms. This cost increase will then be passed on to consumers. Cost push inflation can also arise due to expectations of future inflation. If economic agents expect future inflation to be higher, then it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy and inflation may become higher. This can cause a second round of inflation whereby workers see the purchasing power of their income being reduced and ask for a wage rise. This increases the cost of production for firms, which adds an additional cost push inflation to the economy. This can cause an upward spiral in prices, which are all caused by the initial shock to the economy, which may be an increase in the price of oil. Cost push inflation can also be caused by higher indirect taxes. If the government chooses to increase its indirect taxes on certain goods, firms may choose to pass on these increases to consumers, thus causing the price level to rise. Another type of inflation is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when increases in the level of aggregate demand lead to increased pressure on scarce resources. If we take the classical view of an ADAS diagram, this increase in the level of aggregate demand can result in a positive output gap in the short run. Initially, our economy is at a long-run equilibrium at point A, with a price level PL1 and the maximum output being produced, which is Y1. The increase in aggregate demand is represented by an outward shift of AD, so from AD1 to AD2. This results in a new short-run equilibrium, which is at point B, where real output is higher than it was before, Y2 rather than Y1, and the price level is also higher than it was before, PL1 rather than PL2. This increase in the price level is our demand pull inflation. However, in the long run, factors of production will require higher factor payments, and this causes the SRAS curve to shift upwards from SRAS 1 to SRAS 2. This leads to a new long-run equilibrium, which is at point C, where the price level is PL3, which is higher than both PL1 and PL2, and output is the same as it was in the initial scenario, which is Y3, which is the same as Y1. We can also look at demand pull inflation on a Keynesian diagram. Initially, our economy is at a long-run equilibrium with a price level of PL1 and an output of Y1. We then have an increase in aggregate demand in the economy, which is represented by aggregate demand shifting from AD1 to AD2. Aggregate demand shifts outwards. This results in our economy being at a new equilibrium with more real output, Y2 rather than Y1, but at a higher price level, PL2 rather than PL1. Let's now look at some of the reasons for demand pull inflation. We are looking for anything that will cause aggregate demand to shift outwards. One reason is a monetary or fiscal stimulus. This will cause aggregate demand to shift outwards and the price level to rise. We can also have an increase in the confidence level of economic agents. If economic agents are confident, then consumption and investment will increase, and this will cause aggregate demand to also increase. Faster growth in other countries can also cause aggregate demand to increase, because if there is faster growth in other economies, it is likely that the foreign economies will suck in imports, which will be exports for the domestic economy. Exports are a component of aggregate demand, which means that if there is an increase in exports or an increase in demand for exports, aggregate demand will shift outwards, thus causing an increase in the price level. Another reason for demand pull inflation could be a depreciation in the exchange rate. If a country's exchange rate falls, it makes its goods and services relatively cheap compared to other countries. As your goods and services are now relatively cheaper, it causes exports to increase. Furthermore, a depreciation in your currency makes other countries' goods and services relatively more expensive. Domestic consumers and firms would then switch from consuming foreign goods and services to consuming domestic goods and services. So with a depreciation in the exchange rate, you have an increase in exports in the economy, which is an injection for the economy, and a decrease in imports, which is a leakage for the economy. This results in aggregate demand shifting outwards and an increase in the price level, which is our demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation can be accommodated by an increase in the productive potential of an economy. If supply grows at the same or a greater rate than demand grows in the economy, an economy will not experience excessive demand pull inflation. So the solution to demand pull inflation is any policy that will cause the supply in the economy to increase. So essentially it's any supply side policy. We can show how a supply side policy can facilitate an increase in demand. Let's first look at the classical aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. Initially, our economy is at point A, with a price level PL1 and an output level of Y1. The economy then experiences an increase in the level of aggregate demand, which means aggregate demand shifts outward, and this can be for any of the reasons that we discussed earlier. If supply was to remain the same, i.e. was LRAS 1, we would then see an increase in the price level in both the short run and the long run. If we have supply-side policies, the productive potential of the economy will increase and the LRAS curve will shift outwards from LRAS 1 to LRAS 2. So if we have an increase in aggregate demand and an increase in aggregate supply, like we have here, our economy will be at a new long-run equilibrium at point B, which is where the price level is the same as it was before, PL1, and real output is greater than it was before, Y2 rather than Y1. The additional demand has been accommodated because of the increase in the productive potential of the economy, the supply side policies. We can also show demand pull inflation being accommodated by supply side policies on a Keynesian aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. Initially, our economy is producing a real output level of Y1 at a price level of PL1. Then our economy experiences an increase in aggregate demand, AD1 to AD2. If the supply side of the economy was to remain constant, i.e. was LRAS 1, then this would result in a greater level of real output, but at a higher price level in the economy. Now, suppose that the government engages in supply-side policies, which increases the productive potential of the economy. This causes the LRAS curve to shift outwards, which is LRAS 1 to LRAS 2. With the new level of demand and the new level of aggregate supply, our economy will be at an equilibrium with the price level the same as it was before, PL1, and a greater level of real output, which is Y2 rather than Y1. Another way to control demand pull inflation is to control what aggregate demand is. If the government believes that aggregate demand in the economy is becoming too high, they could engage in contractionary fiscal and monetary policy, which would cause aggregate demand to shift inwards, which would lower the pressure on inflation. However, the best remedy for demand pull inflation is to increase the productive potential of the economy, which is done through supply side policies.